fiction into fact.
Sometimes kind of real architectural life interferes with intellectual architectural life.
There is no such thing as architecture.
Hello, and welcome to the first Editor's Choice edition of Architecture Talk. I am your producer and temporary host, Sammy Prouty. Typically on this podcast, Vikram Prakash hosts conversations with contemporary thinkers that expand how we know and imagine the built environment. However, this week, and for the remainder of the summer, we will be putting some of our favorite conversations in conversation with one another, in hope that these abridged pairings reveal something more about the ideas discussed than either conversation could convey alone. Our first pairing explores the question, what makes a city vibrant? Comprised of our conversations with Jeff Howe and Manish Chalana on messy urbanism, which is episode 10, and our conversation with Rahul Mehrotra regarding ephemeral urbanism, which is episode 16. Together, these conversations reveal something unexpected that may start to describe the indescribable vitality that some of our favorite cities in the world express. We will start with our conversation with Jeff and Manish, in which they expose the often overlooked complexity that makes up the mess and the cultural assumptions that keep so many Western cities tidy. Here we go.
So, Manish and Jeff, welcome to Architecture Talk.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You have just published a co-edited book called Messy Urbanism, Understanding the Other Cities of Asia. This is very weird. Why would we want to defend, describe, and write a book on a messy city? Versus what? I mean, what is it? Are we arguing against something, or is there something endemic and intrinsic to the idea of mess that is important? Manish, what do you think?
I think we're not arguing against the modern city or a planned city or any city for that matter. We're trying, through this work, we're trying to understand the complexity of messiness in the context of Asian cities, position it so others who may not be in Asia or who are unfamiliar with these cities begin to understand it and see it more clearly.
So I'm trying to think about a mess. And the image that immediately comes to my mind, and this may be a cliched image, but nevertheless, let's go with it, is that fantastic video of the Mekong Express market in Bangkok, where we have this commuter train, electric commuter train. On the tracks, there is a vibrant informal market, and which miraculously makes way for the train as it passes through, and then sets right back up. Jeff, is that the mess we are talking about? Is that the kind of things?
That's the kind of thing we're talking about, but that's also a case in which what appears to be messy is actually extremely organized.
Oh,
right?
you're saying the mess is organized?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's messy because it's not following the kind of structure and order that we come to associate with a urban space.
I see.
A typically planned urban space. I'm wondering why you consider that is a case of kind of messiness as well. And if you look at the example there, how things move away in a matter of seconds.
Right.
Almost everything is on some sort of mobile structure.
Right.
Things could be unfolded and folded.
Folded, unfolded, laid out, unlaid out.
It's extremely well choreographed.
Okay, right? So that's a nice word, choreographed. Yeah. What distinguishes choreography from traditional planning?
Yeah, choreography has a temporal dimension. I think is often lacking in a kind of formally planned kind of urban space.
Right.
And it can change. It can evolve depending on the circumstances. It adapts. Right. To things that are happening that could change from time to time. And so it takes on a different kind of organization.
There are multiple layers of order in this system. If you begin to think about it, they exactly know when the train's coming, and everybody knows when to move things away from the train. And they have to have the shop fronts and awning on some kind of movable system so that it goes away, and then it comes back. And then even in the way the shopkeepers organize along the track. There's also a system to that. They know where you need your spot or how you share spots during different times of the day.
But these are all the wrong words. You are saying this is ordered, it is systematized. So make the case for the mess for me then.
No, so the messiness we're talking about. I mean, I think we use messy urbanism as the title for the book. I mean, more to probably provoke, and also to play on the word itself, right? That there's a certain kind of imagery that we tend to associate with this word messiness, and we're actually interested in kind of challenging that kind of perception.
Right.
So what we may consider as messy is in fact quite order, but it takes on a different kind of order that we normally would understand.
Would you think the sort of Bernard Tschumy's concept of event city begins to capture some of these ideas? The city as the concatenation of space and time, which then could be called event?
Mehrotra's concept of kinetic city also gets into that direction.
That's right.
So a lot of people are talking about this to sort of understand time and how it interfaces and plays with space in cities, and the kinetic city is taking that idea further.
Let's say event or kinetic city, this idea that there is time must be taken into accord is true actually all cities, right? So let's push this a little bit and say what distinguishes this in the case of the Asian city that you're trying to talk about.
Well, I would go back to Bernard Tschumy's event city as kind of a point of reference. I think there's a certain kind of romanticization of this kind of unintended events in the city.
Right.
But I think we're talking about something different here. I think we're talking about, again, going back to this notion of choreography. Choreography, things that are actually organized, they are not unintended. They're actually quite intended, but they don't appear to be so because of the way we might be biased against seeing certain kind of things. So I think that's what we're getting at.
Yeah.
Not the kind of
not the accidental city,
right?
Or
not the romanticized notion of events, but more the kind of the more everyday,
right?
The vernacular, kind of activity that takes.
That's fantastic. Yes, because I think in the West the idea of accident and the idea of the city as fully organized, the best city as that which enables the free agent citizen to do whatever he or she wants is kind of a utopian ideal, versus thinking about the city as actually another kind of organization which actually requires you to be on your feet in time and exact, rather than totally, in a sense, free.
Right. It's something that you have to negotiate. How do you negotiate with interaction with different actors? It's really how groups of people operate, rather than this kind of single individual doing almost like anarchist, notion of in urban events.
So the theory, if it sort of starts to push this into the future, and if we start to speculatively start making the argument that the Asian choreographed messy city is the template for cities for the future.
Yeah, I'm not sure that it would offer a template for the future cities, because it has inherent complexities that work in certain sort of local context with local populations, and so I'm trying to understand whether we could manufacture messiness. I doubt we can do that, or should we be even doing that?
But we can choreograph it.
We could choreograph it, of course. But then by doing that, we're taking away some of the agency and the inherent qualities that produce that messiness.
But I think if you look at it as an example of sharing a space, right?
Yeah.
So the train track being shared by the marketer, the customer, the train, as a form of infrastructure, the passenger. I think one thing I can see in the future is that more of these kind of sharing occurring in urban spaces in multiple cultural contexts, and we can the same street can be used for multiple layers of activities.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, we do. We close our streets. We do street fairs,
Because of
street markets.
streets, we now have the parklet. We have complete
We have
streets. Not to the same kind of intensity as we see in some of the Asian examples.
So is it just a question of intensity, Jeff? Or do you think there's a sort of a DNA problem in thinking about these things?
There is a DNA problem. There are different kind of legal systems and cultural norm and things like that.
Yeah.
Things that may be acceptable in one cultural context is not in another. So I don't think that can be changed overnight. But it's probably good that they are not changed overnight because it takes some,
it takes time.
It takes time. It takes time to kind of adapt. But I think we are moving in the directions.
Right.
Yeah, for sure.
But let's move this in a little more sort of cultural dimension. And you talked earlier about of course we don't have enough people in the cities. We don't have the densities. We don't have the numbers, perhaps. Perhaps, Central Park in part was made to move out all the Irish and Italian squatters and the African American squatters. It was made to clean them out. The history of racial segregation and cultural segregation is an endemic part of the planned character of the American city, right? I mean, we just bought a property here in Seattle where it has an old covenant, that black people weren't allowed, African Americans weren't allowed. They were, written right there in black and white. It's just unbelievable.
They still exist.
It still exists. It's just ignored, but it's still on the property deed. And contrasting that with the vision, back to my favorite Blade Runner image, with all this Asian food everywhere. And in the context of today's charged discussions around immigration in the country, I mean, I think the messy city also implies a certain kind of a cultural vision. I mean, beyond sort of certain metrics of density and mixed use and so on. Would you say that a kind of a cultural heterogeneity is necessary for that kind of a negotiated mess?
Well, I think one of the things that we wanted to really kind of tackle in the book is how the notion of messiness is really kind of politically and culturally conditioned, right?
Right.
That one particular conditional phenomenon may be considered as orderly by a certain group, but is considered messy by another group. So these are really kind of value kind of laden, perspective, and oftentimes is the marginalized, the social group and their lifestyles and the places they occupy are often considered as messy from the mainstream society's perspective, and therefore they're often the ones that had to be, eradicated or regulated or
But are you arguing that they bring a richness to the city, which would lead to the argument a certain amount of marginalization is necessary?
Well, I'm not saying that certain kind of marginalization is necessary. I'm saying that we have a tendency in our culture, and I think no matter which culture they are, to kind of marginalize certain kind of phenomena.
Of course.
And it could be because of racial discrimination in the previous time, or even continued today. But these, I think, are part of the social structure that I think produce these what we know conceptually as messiness.
Right.
And that, and along with the concept of messiness comes, stigma, comes prejudice, biases, and tension and conflict in the society that could be better addressed.
Yeah, and that's true. I mean, for instance, I've seen, at least in India, I imagine it's probably true in East Asia, Taiwan, etc. also. People who have been used to living and benefiting from the mess of the Asian city will very happily move into a gated suburban community and think of that as upward mobility, right? And take out the vibrant messiness of a city and see that as progress. So, I mean, what I'm saying is that the same kind of discriminations, of course, also work throughout the world, right?
Yes.
I mean, in the context of India, we, and perhaps other parts of the world as well, we otherize the non-planned city. And because of that, there's stigma attached to it, because we feel that, those are centers for disease and unhygienic living conditions and something we understand as or categorize as slums in India. Right? But then, as you're saying, that the middle class benefits from that urban condition because they rely on those populations for almost everything. Right. The city will shut down if those populations just decide to pack and leave. And none of the middle class, I think these populations subsidize middle class's prosperity.
Of course, we don't want to romanticize the mess either, right? I mean, do you talk about this in the book, or do you imply it, that in what ways is the mess fantastic and fascinating, and in what ways is it not? Right? I mean, isn't that a key point?
Right. I mean, we deliberately try not to romanticize and critique, this typical kind of romanticization of the informal. I think they are deep kind of structural issues that we need to address. This question about slum, there's a tendency to kind of, again, romanticize how people were able to, make use of very little resources.
This slum pornography is a problem.
Right, the slum porn is problematic.
It is problematic.
And there are deep structural issues that, in terms of social segregation, in terms of social immobility, people cannot get out of, that kind of situation.
Right.
And so again, we are trying to look at how these phenomena are. It's not just about density or spatial organization. There's kind of deep, kind of political and social questions,
and I would argue cultural questions.
The cultural questions too.
So we're trying to, at the same time, not romanticize or fetishize or aestheticize urban informality on the one end, but also not try to regulate it on the other. Essentially, planners and designers are always looking at it from two bookends. Either you think, oh, this is great, how they've been able to put together their entire settlements that function with so little, resources. And on the other hand, planners would always want to formalize the informal because, it's messy, it's disorderly, and it needs... and granted, there are lots of issues as you're talking about, but we don't want to sort of, just hinge our understanding to the extremes because there's a lot in between. There's a lot of complexity and perhaps lots of, if you're solution-driven, there are perhaps many solutions in between, not on one end or the other.
That's right.
Yeah, I think we're more interested in the mechanisms. Mechanism, how things work. What makes some of these...
the choreography. We're back to the choreography.
Work in a way that is not supported by the current systems of planning, right? So I think if you look behind those phenomenon, there's a degree of kind of organization, self-organization. Like people negotiate, they form some sort of network. Right. They communicate, in ways that is not facilitated by the typical kind of legal and institutional channels.
Yes.
It's a mechanism that recognizes the agency of individuals.
And communities and groups.
Community that we can all participate in making
recognizes
something happen.
And brackets it. Because negotiation is a process of saying, well, it's not just about whatever you want.
It's not just free for all.
It's not a free for all.
Right. You have to more of organization that require negotiation among individual and collective bodies, and you require people intermediate kind of actors who can go back and forth between multiple groups, and that's the kind of things that I think we should be looking at it and perhaps study
and augment and.
Right.
I mean, so the big question in Seattle is density, homelessness, and how do we deal with disparity. But also the other sort of at a high altitude, even higher altitude question is, as big money moves into the city, how could these processes be deployed or put into place to negotiate between the city as it is today and the city that's, coming in with the new money in Seattle. Seattle's, are we, the general question is, are we going to just become San Francisco, go exactly the same way? And so far, honestly, it looks like that's what's going to happen. Correct? how could, this choreographed negotiation that you all are talking about, is that a model for thinking about how one could think an alternate future for the changing Seattle?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at, if you just kind of explore this question of negotiation and maybe use that as a basis to develop kind of alternative, living arrangements, right? That young people could stay with older adults who have rooms in their homes,
Yes.
Things like that are more kind of self-organized.
Uber rentals.
Something like, yeah. Well, we have Airbnb already as a model. And rather than this kind of top-down, we have this in Seattle, this kind of grand bargain. Basically, we require a developer to put in a certain percentage of, affordable housing units,
"Quote unquote" affordable.
Yeah, in exchange for higher density, which basically just make things even more affordable for most people.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing negotiated there. I mean, it's just a SOP. It's just a
right, and that's was supposed to address our housing problem. Yeah. And with just one single solution.
Right.
There's more complicated than that, but I think we also need to look at how people can self-organize and come up with different ways of addressing the housing issue.
How would they have done that in Hong Kong? How would they? Let's cut paste Taipei or Delhi, culturally speaking, into Seattle. This is purely counterfactual, I know. But nevertheless, what could one radically, just imagining blue sky, could we do different?
Well, in Delhi, as you know, in India, the state takes responsibility for social housing to some degree, and you could argue that it's not a successful model also. But here in Seattle, we've also been trying micro-housing, we're trying tent cities, we're trying different ways of different readjustments to the housing conditions and perhaps address problems of homelessness. Have we achieved much? I don't think so. The problem is growing rapidly because of our weather and our more liberal sort of climate. The transients are attracted to be in the city, and that's only going to grow. So there's some level of informality or messiness, if you will, is already coming into the city, right? You see tents around, parks and other places. So there's some kind of messiness that the city has to now address. But their reaction would be to sort of move them to designated, areas where tent cities are.
Or find good housing.
Or find good housing for them. So
if you find good housing for the homeless people, then all the mess goes. No, but what I'm saying is, culturally speaking, what could we imagine? The Pine Triangle, which is sort of housing building central right nowadays in Seattle, everywhere is, but that's certainly one place. Or the light rail corridor moving to the south. Culturally speaking, where there is a diversity of peoples, actually, where new immigrants into the city are settling into those areas, right? There's sort of the rich Amazon folk settling into Pipeline area and the other diverse population settling into the southern corridors. I mean, what kind of agential, participative, human-centered things could you imagine which could be done in a way that are different from today, as learned from the Asian example? What would those be?
Well, I mean, I think one of the problem, the housing crisis in Seattle is that 80% of our land is zoned for single-family housing. Right. And which means very low density, very little mixing, very little kind of messiness, if you will. Yeah. And that is a cultural question. Right. Aside from individuals kind of protecting their own interests, and if we can demonstrate that higher density living is a desirable arrangement and and would enable it to resolve the housing crisis to some extent.
And what if we sort of designated that all land at a certain distance from all light rail and areas is free vending zones? Like we have a sort of a music law for musicians, street musicians. We could have a sort of a radical law for free vending
Right, it could be job opportunity for homeless people, right?
I have pictures from South Seattle that I can share with you where I've seen people selling live ducks and chickens.
Right.
Yeah, so there's a lot of informality in that regard going on already.
Yeah.
I bought chilies and tomatoes last summer from a lady who was just sitting there on the sidewalk, just like you see in India or other places. And there were 4 women hanging around her and haggling over price. Right, so that kind of informality, in South Seattle.
Right.
So you see that we need to be thinking about making the city sort of creating spaces in the city for such users. Again, not to orchestrate it too much.
So how do you semi-choreograph something like that?
Yeah, so because the city could then say, okay, this is an area where you can do informal vending.
You can do anything.
Which there is also night markets and all that. You're thinking about it, right? So that's also fine. I think it's a step in the right direction. But then that doesn't bring in the vibrancy that we are sort of thinking about, the spontaneity and non-planned sort of, chance encounters and occurrences on the streets. That doesn't do that. And I think... But even to acknowledge that these uses are happening in this global city like Seattle, which is the headquarters of Amazon and Microsoft, that says people are selling live ducks, even to acknowledge it and sort of have some spaces for that would be a good start.
Yeah, I think it'd be so fantastic if we can imagine, enable, and legislate a future for a prosperous Seattle, which is different from the usual narrative, or we just don't follow the expectation of whatever happened in the other digital parts of the world.
So a prosperous city is a just city, and I think Seattle is already prosperous, but it's not just.
Well, the thing is the Asian city just?
Asian city is also not just, but I think it provides opportunities for multiple income groups to make some type of living.
Yeah. I think I'm all for that, but I think even as a halfway stop, at least have a vibrant city on the way to a just city would be, and I think there's a sort of a continuity between them.
But that would require a cultural shift. We were talking about, even in Seattle right now, I was reading just this week that the neighborhood coalitions are suing Hala.
Right. Not in my backyard.
It's sort of that not in my background idea that, bring in density but not so close to us.
So that's how we negotiate in the United States, is we sue. See, that's how we do things.
That's the culture.
That's also the culture.
Okay, moving towards the end here. So I'm just trying to theorize, what this implies as a vision for the city. You mentioned briefly in your introduction of thinking of perhaps, theoretically speaking, post-structuralist ideas of heterogeneity, indeterminability, undecidability are useful theoretical constructs to begin to think about what this vision of the city is versus, a lucid utopian planned city. I mean, what do you think of the idea of the palimpsest as a descriptor of what a messy city would be? Do you think that's a good starting point for a theoretical framing for this idea?
Yes, I think palimpsest in the sense that there are multiple layers, right?
Where all layers the layers aren't erased.
Right, layers are not erased. I think in the typical kind of planned city, there are not enough layers. I mean, most of the layers are formal kind of institutions that regulates and dictates what needs to happen. In the city that we looked at in the book, there are more layers, but more also kind of informal layers that operate kind of in between, the formal layer that provide additional kind of looseness, right, that one can begin to negotiate, and zones that are kind of flexible, that that will open up kind of opportunity for a different kind of spatial arrangement, right, and that's the kind of layer I think we need to have more in the planned city, whether it's in Asia or in other places in the world. The room for negotiation, I think, is what allow for adaptation.
Right.
Things happens as economy booms or shrinks.
Right.
Those are the spaces that enable people to adapt in terms of their housing needs or room for kind of microeconomy. And I think that's what could be possible.
Right. I think that's right. How to negotiate and choreograph the palimpsest of the city. It's been great talking to you, Manish and Jeff. Thank you for being on Architecture Talk.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Jeff and Manish return often to the term choreography as a way of describing the sort of dance that is constantly and at many specific scales moving throughout the urban landscape of these cities. In our next conversation with Rahul Mehrotra, he discusses this choreography at a much larger scale as he urges us to think about all of the urban environment as a temporary and transitionary solution.
So, Rahul, you have been talking about this idea of the kinetic city and now the ephemeral city. And you recently ran this studio out of Harvard on the Kumbh Mela. And your current term is ephemeral urbanism, and I suppose by implication, ephemeral architecture. So let's just start by asking you, how do you define ephemeral in this case as a concise sort of term?
Well, I think just to answer that, I'm going to start at what you pointed out as the kinetic city. I started writing about the kinetic city because having studied urban design and then practicing in a condition like India, one saw that actually what we had come to understand as urban design, it's premised so much on what is really the static city, which is embodied in architecture, very stable. And then there are narratives that kind of draw out of that. In fact, the whole narrative about conservation comes from that, about kind of this illusion of permanence. So I began to theorize this condition and began to, refer to it as a kinetic city, largely because I felt that the binary of the formal and the informal, which is the way temporal landscape was described, was non-productive, because when we set up binaries as designers, we then, as a logical next step, have to lay alliance to one of those worlds. So we either become architects who work with developers and governments and live in the formal world and create more static and permanent or supposedly permanent architecture, or we become architects that work with the informal landscape, and by extension we become activists, we become community organizers, we become architects, but in terms of upgrading squatter settlements, etc. And I felt, my God, we should be actually living in both worlds simultaneously, because design is about synthesis, design is about blurring these boundaries, design is about creating third space to find these solutions, etc. And so that's how the notion, a kind of theoretical framework using the idea of the kinetic city, came to occupy me for a very long time, really. And I used to provocatively use the Kumbh Mela as a way of saying, look here, there's a whole megacity that does that.
Mm-hmm.
And then we were fortunate enough, because circumstances led us to go and study the Kumbh Mela through the university, which was a fascinating project. I'm happy to speak more about it. But basically, what the experience of looking at the Kumbh Mela did, and to see a mega city of this scale on a kind of temporal, very quick temporal scale, 55 days, constructed in 6 or 7 weeks, dismantled in a week, was absolutely mind-boggling. And then when we put that work together, I think a natural way to describe it was mapping the ephemeral megacity. And that led me to think, how could one expand the categorization, the theoretical framework of the kinetic city to encompass a much broader landscape, which I believe is an important landscape to look at. And so I extended the word kinetic to ephemeral and city to urbanism, so that it could be broader and not defined just by narrow parameters of design or building imagination. But for me, the biggest lesson in this whole experience of attempting to theorize what is a majority of the landscape in places like India made me question whether permanence has become too much of a default condition in our imagination of the world as architects, and by extension in the pedagogy, how we teach architects, etc. And so, really, the thrust here has been to, as I say, infect the discussion about urbanism, about urban design, about cities with these sort of temporal landscape, because otherwise, looking at the static city has become a default condition. And so, therefore, now to answer what I would mean by ephemeral is exactly what the word suggests: hard to capture, not always tangible, momentary, temporary, and all of the above, which is to say that landscapes like this, which form a part of any city, is just that in parts of the global south, if you want to use that description, these temporal landscapes form a bulk of the city. But I would argue these appear in New York and, of course, on the West Coast because climate allows it. Margaret Crawford has written about everyday urbanism. This kind of temporal landscape and the way it articulates its presence in cities is also visible there. And so I think the ephemeral is that aspect of the city that is temporary in nature, whether it's a performance that someone does on a plaza in a city and suddenly activates that space, not only with the presence of other human beings, but also with shifting meaning. And then it recedes, it fades, it leaves no trace. It's an enacted process. I would argue the spectacle in Indian cities or in Mumbai of the immersion of the Ganesh god is one such thing. Here, the spectacle is not captured. It's again an enacted moment. It has no memory, but it is a spectacle. So why do we only think architecture should be the spectacle of the city? And so it's, I think, challenge some of these business as usual questions that this research is aimed at.
Okay, so anything that is not traditionally permanent architecture, you would characterize as belonging to the ephemeral side of thinking architecture and urbanism.
I would think so. I would think so.
So it includes the agency of people doing things, and it also includes temporary structures that are put in place in between more permanent architecture and the agency of people doing things.
Right. So, Vikram, I think again, and I don't disagree with you, but considering we are trying to kind of nuance and expand this conversation or this categorization, let me say that even there is a massive gray scale, right? So there are things, the agency of people, that happen by the hour. Little hawkers that come and sell bananas and apples happens by the 4 hours. Other things happen for a week. Massive markets in Mexico City in parking lots happen for the weekend. The Kumbh Mela happens for 55 days. Mining towns happen for 55 years.
Right.
So let me say that I would say that if we can almost clearly predict an expiration date or an expiration time for that particular phenomena, whether it's temporary architecture or the agency of people, I would think could be, in the debate of urbanism, could be ephemeral.
So, in that case, I would argue that all architecture and urbanism is ephemeral because, after all, as Benjamin said, the destiny of all architecture and civilization is ruin.
Totally.
Everything must sooner or later come to an end,
Right.
and wither away. And in that sense, what I'm hearing you say is that this notion can be used to critique the entire sort of privileging of the idea of permanence in architectural and urban thinking, rather, and not just specifically introducing a new dimension about widening the scope of what architecture and urbanism is. Is that right?
Yes, I mean, I think that's one way you could argue it. And I think, at a more personal note, which might help expand the conversation. I think what interests me personally about the notion of the ephemeral and why I think we should take it seriously is another framing, which is the framing of the notion of absolute solutions versus transitionary solutions.
Yes.
Or transitionary conditions.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I think we take stability also as a default condition. And then that sort of reinforces the narrative of permanence and the narrative of conservation and all the debates that come out of it. So, what does that mean for design? Are we designing relatively permanent solutions for relatively temporary problems. And so I think to challenge the notion of absolute solutions is where I think the category of the ephemeral can also be useful for us to imagine transitions. And I think as a profession, whether it's planning, urban design, architecture, we don't pay enough attention to this question. I think landscape architects by default have to, because plants are life, and life, they are forced to imagine a temporal scale for what they do, at least the ones that I think are the sensitive ones.
Right.
But in architecture, this has completely fallen off the radar of the discussion, and I think we are worse off for that.
Right. I mean, I think both in architecture and by extension in traditional urban design and planning, the notion of grounding place and building a city as an enclosed wall, which is a defensive bulwark against the possibility of change, is the idea that seems to govern. And therefore, I would say, by contrast, what you are talking about belongs more to the register of nomadism. And the other sort of more temporary, transient, dismantleable, unproperty attached notions of dwelling, being, and relating to the world that are by and large largely that are, as you are articulating, actually not lost, because
Yes.
actually a lot of people are significantly transient
Yes.
and nomadic still, right?
Yes. So that is like the blanket condition. Yeah, that description was totally accurate. Now, so the question is, and this becomes the difficult one. So the question is twofold. One is that that's part of the world. And I think the argument is not to say that that's the preferred reality. And the argument is also not to say that we need to stabilize that transient population forever, because I personally think the state of flux will continue for years and if not centuries.
But it is the argument to move the more permanent way of thinking into a more transient way of thinking.
Right. So therefore, then the second question becomes is how can you use the more transient productively in our cities? And even J.B. Jackson, that we need this sort of third landscape, which is the temporal again re-entering our cities in a productive way. And he wrote this in the 70s or maybe even the early 80s, I'm not sure. But basically, the one example that he actually gave was a circus. And he said how the traveling circus, which is this enormous tent that comes and gets pitched up in the middle of the city, suddenly creates and disrupts what is the strict delineation of the static city, because not only is a kind of fantasy played out in this tent of animals and elephants and tropical beings that sometimes in the West have never been seen, but suddenly in the circus, children from different ethnicities become aware of each other. They sit across the ring and they are made. Different income groups occupy the same space in the same way as movie theaters did in many cultures, And so he said this sort of infecting the permanent landscape of the static city with these kind of temporal landscapes is very productive. And so there's a kind of dimension at a micro scale where I think learning from the transient, the temporal, one can actually create a much richer existence in cities. And I would argue the farmers market in its popularity is somewhat about that, because it brings face-to-face contact. It suddenly allows people to negotiate with each other, to get to know your vendor, to find out about the farm that the food was grown in, which has been completely erased from our lives when we walk into a Trader Joe's or a Wegmans or a Whole Foods even.
So are you arguing more about the importance and necessity of feathering in the transient into the relatively permanent landscape?
Right.
Or are you arguing about just rethinking the entire notions of architecture, urbanism, and landscape via the categories of the transient?
Vikram, I would say both. But if I had to be more specific, and I've never thought of it till you've posed this question, which is lovely about these conversations, is I'm actually arguing for nuancing, broadening the tool set with which we look at cities, and to include the notion of the transient, the kinetic, the everyday landscape in serious and productive ways as part of the repertoire that we use as urbanists. And I think the most productive thing at the other end of the spectrum, which will help nuance our thinking about cities, is the notion of time. As planners, urban designers, and architects, we actually don't know. We don't deal with time in a productive way as part of our repertoire. So there's a dimension of this kind of ephemeral imagination, which has to do with space, which itself is ephemeral. Just the way it's contained and articulated could be different, and it could occur at much shorter rhythms. In the traditional use of recycle, we think of an industrial building. After its life is over in 100 years, it gets recycled into a museum, for example. There are shorter rhythms too. But maybe this recycling or this ephemeral use of space could be in much shorter cycles. Maybe buildings and cities are imagined as that happening because we are experiencing much more flux. I think my point is only this, that in this whole discussion, I think we have to detest from putting together binaries, which is temporary, permanent, or compostable versus non-compostable, etc. Because there is a whole range of gray scales between them, which creates all sorts of situations where something doesn't need to be completely ephemeral. It can be partially ephemeral, which itself gives it a robustness more than something which is so very finite in the way materials are articulated and embodied. And so I think if you shift for a second to the debate about conservation, because
Okay, let's talk conservation.
because that works exactly to the other extreme, that it detests compostability because it is about extending kind of life. And in the book Contents, which Rem Koolhaas sort of did, he has some wonderful research there on conservation, where he basically shows through a series of infographics how the time between a particular act for conservation and the objects that act is concerned about conserving is actually collapsing. By the time you start with acts in the 1800s or 1872 to be precise, I think that's worrying about objects from the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th century BC. And by the time you come to the 1972 or 73 or 74 revision of these acts, they're already worrying about the 1960s, which means the gap then between the act and the object it's concerned with has collapsed to 10 years. And so really the way the world is moving, those will collapse to nothing, which means
And they'll go into the future. You will make future objects to preserve
correct.
them. Yeah.
That's correct. So you could provocatively say that now when buildings come up for building sanctions, one of the things that a sanctioning authority will decide is whether in the future this building should be a listed building. The proposition here, at least the implication of what the research is telling me, is that I think how we calibrate the life cycle of buildings, and by extension the life cycle of cities, needs a complete rethink. It needs to be nuanced. It's not one or the other. We need to make these transitions, because this won't happen overnight. This might take 100 years to make this transition, where the city has maybe 50% of its space which is in flux. So to make the transition, I think it's useful to look at the ephemeral, to deal and grapple with the notion of time in more rigorous ways, and to really challenge the default condition that we engage with, which is the default condition of permanence when we imagine buildings and by extension cities.
So how do you respond to the more traditional critique, I suppose, of your position, which is that the introduction and emphasis on transience and impermanence runs against the sort of reinforcement of stable identities, which is considered traditionally to be a function of architecture and urbanism? How would you respond to the critique that transience is usually a symptom of anxiety and displacement?
Right. I think before globalization, to the extent that we have seen it, before information technology, before people living virtual reality in the way majority of the population engages in now, I think that would have all been a very valid critique. But I think now it's emerging, it isn't stable. I think, and part of the reaction of the nationalism that we are seeing everywhere is a reaction to this fluidity. Is there new forms of this identity construction that are occurring? No, and I mean, as Arjun Apudara and many other anthropologists, but Arjun's writings just sort of come to mind. Is the formation we live with multiple identities simultaneously. We are part of multiple neighborhoods simultaneously. We are part of professional affiliations, which give us one part of our identity. We are part of neighborhoods in a physical sense that give us another part of our identity. It's the simultaneity of this that constructs a much more kaleidoscopic kind of construction of identity, which is part of the reason why there's such instability in the world today, because this hasn't quite settled. So I think those critiques, I think, were very valid. But I mean, I think this world is shifting so much now that I'm not sure that critique is useful any longer, which is not to say that the transient and the ephemeral have the answers. The question is, I think, they might help us respond more robustly to this transient condition that we are all in on this planet.
Right. I mean, I think that's true. I mean, of course, it's an important question in the current political climate of the sort of anti-immigrant rhetoric that we are hearing from our president and other people. By contrast, both you and I, we are sort of nomadic, displaced people, and if one defines the United States as a country of immigrants, then one can argue that this sort of transient, transformed identity has always been in place. The sort of besides the urban, the other sort of traditional argument against that is that land identity in a more, let's say, Heideggerian mode emerges from the land, and that is something one should affiliate with in a more phenomenological way.
Right. And I think partly, I mean, it also has to do with the reality of, I mean, just to go back to that melting pot metaphor, is that, I mean, there's also a sort of pragmatic, opportunistic condition here when we talk about immigrants and things, is that the absorption, the melting pot, which very easily facilitates the construction of new identities for immigrant people when there are opportunities, which means they dissolve into the landscape through economic opportunities, through political affiliations, which are more open and much more absorptive, begin to get saturated at some point. And I mean, I think what we are seeing is, I believe at least, a saturation of that, in a sense that it's the absorptive nature, the absorptive possibilities of that happening have diminished to some extent, and I think a lot of the polarization comes from that.
Talk to me about some project that you have done recently, or in the recent past, which embodies this transitional, non-absolute architecture and urban thinking. How have you manifested that in your work?
Well, I mean, I think I would start by talking to you about the urban conservation work we did in Mumbai, which was, getting the first urban conservation legislation in, and then realizing that, the kind of paradigms we were trying to apply didn't bring any effect on the ground. And it made me then frame the problem in two different ways. One was, it made me question that we are sitting in India, we're looking at English heritage, we're looking at American legislation, and we are trying to apply it here in the 4th district of Mumbai. And it made me ask the question that when the custodians of an environment and the creators of the environment are two different cultures, why would we apply only the paradigms of the creators of the environment? Because now, as custodians, we are from a different culture. So, which means our relationship to this environment is completely different. And that then led me to the notion of looking at significance and deconstructing that a little bit, because conservation debates are overwhelmingly determined by going into a location, discerning its significance, and then going crazy about trying to reinforce that significance. And we began to say that if we are the culture that now is in custody of this environment and it's different from the people who created it, how do we construct a new significance for it? Now, this is not a cop-out, because here then the task for the architect becomes even harder, because what the task for the architect then is to create the illusion of that environment, which is the intent of conservation and the stability that you want in the city, but to let it be occupied by completely different sensibilities. And that's a very hard kind of combination to work in. But for me, that's a transitionary solution, because that's a way that you make the transition for people to value an environment, and to value it not for the oppression that it might signify, but to value it for the having internalized it and come out stronger, to value it from an environmental perspective of beautiful buildings with incredible embodied energy and labor and sweat equity by local people, which should be kept as memory. And thirdly, to create a stability and again a form of transition in terms of disruptions in the environment, because the time we were working on all of this was when we also liberalized our economy and global capital was arriving every second morning into Mumbai. And a large part of the city was under threat because the government would want to redevelop areas, etc., which would be create enormous disruptions. Forget disruptions in the cultural fabric, which is maybe intangible, but disruptions in traffic, in infrastructure, in a whole lot of things. So for me, conservation then became an instrument of planning to modulate the rate of change in what was my environment, an environment I grew up in, and an environment I loved and I wanted to see protected. And it became an instrument to modulate the rate of change. Now, in 20 years, another generation might think about it differently, and every generation has the right to decide how much change it can psychologically and culturally absorb. And maybe they will decide to remove the legislation, and that be it. But for me, it was a transitionary strategy. It was a strategy where I was more interested in breaking away from blanket development control rules for the whole city and trying to designate 14 zones in the city that would have their own bylaws to demonstrate you could have special planning zones. And so there were many things at play, but it was really about dealing with a transitionary situation.
It's been a pleasure having you on Architecture Talk. Thank you, Rahul.
Thank you very much, Vikram. Really enjoyed this.
So, Sammy, that was very interesting juxtaposition. Ephemeral urbanism and the messy Asian city. What did you think about that? What did you learn?
I think what was the most important point in those conversations was the variety of scales that is being discussed as temporal in the urban landscape. Not just the changing of the markets as the train comes by, but also the actual reimagining of the life cycle of a city or of a building as part of the discussion of what should be considered more ephemeral as we design.
Yeah, really. So the city is something that's not really the actual physical stuff or even sort of human habitation, but all kinds of stuff, all jumbled together. Yes, something like that?
Yeah, it's hard to describe rhythms of the entirety of the city in terms of its life cycle. The scale is so large. Then you can see really minute rhythms constantly at like the pedestrian scale, or when Jeff and Manish are talking about sharing space, and you can see the rhythms of how a building changes program constantly throughout the day.
What do you think will be our next amazing juxtaposition?
So next we are going to be talking about storytelling.
Thank you for listening to Architecture Talk. This is Vikram Prakash, your host, and our producer is the one and only Sammy Prouty, a graduate student of architecture here at the University of Washington in Seattle. I hope you all enjoyed our conversation, and if you did, please do take a moment to subscribe and to rate us on iTunes. See you next time. Take care. Goodbye.